this chapter on blood, I've got it divided into two parts. The red blood cell stuff, and then the white blood cell stuff with blood clotting is a separate day. So I'll go as far as I can go today. And if we don't finish this first part of the blood slides, we'll do it in lab next week, probably. So maybe you already know more about blood than hormones. I bet you do. If you had high school A&P, I think that they talk a lot more about blood than hormones, from what I remember. The major function of the blood is to circulate chemicals through your body. All different kinds of chemicals that are needed by your body. The major ones being oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we come back and talk about those in detail when we talk about respiratory system. But the blood carries them. The blood carries nutrients, sugar, salts, vitamins, minerals, waste products, and now we also know hormones. It carries hormones all over the body. Its secondary function is it also lets immune cells circulate through our body and look for trouble, which is one of my favorite things to talk about, and we'll get to that part in the second lecture on blood. So if you have to give a blood sample, or later if you have to take a blood sample, not pleasant, but they fill up these tubes and then they go away, right? And then you get a report later saying, this were your blood levels of this, that, and the other. One of the first things that they do with those is they put those tubes into a centrifuge and spin them. And the heavier components settle down at the bottom, the lighter stuff stays at the top. And when you do that, that kind of shows you what the overall components are. So this is generally what that would look like. And I've got a bigger, higher up picture on the next slide of spun down blood. So what you'll get at the top is plasma, and that's mostly clear. It's liquid, and the plasma will contain within it things that are really small and dissolvable, that don't settle out. All of those things will be in the plasma, and that would include things like ions, like sodium. Marker's kind of dried out. Your sodium, chloride, potassium, other ions that are in your blood that are important for body function. Proteins that are kind of small, and there are certain ones of those what we'll list specifically later. Your blood gases, like what? Oxygen. What's the other one? Your O2 and your CO2 are dissolved in the plasma. Hormones would also be in there because they're small. Big cellular stuff settles down toward the bottom. There's a little layer right here called the buffy coat. Silly name. Buffy coat. That's mostly white blood cells. And then down lower, those are your red blood cells. And look how much of your blood is actually red blood cells. It's jam-packed with it. You're supposed to have a certain percentage. The percentage is called the hematocrit. So some of you, if you're going into exercise phys or nursing, you'll see that word hematocrit. That's a measurement of how much red blood cells, how many red blood cells do you have, and is it generally a good amount or not? If you've got picture slides, maybe draw down here that these are the cells. So cells sink down, plasma and dissolved substances stay at the top. And then here's a breakdown of everything that's in the blood, which is a lot. So whole blood, we divide it into plasma and cells, which we can also call formed elements. That's really old-fashioned. Formed elements. So the formed elements are cells. They might be red blood cells, they might be white blood cells, they might be platelets. Platelets are pretty cool. Platelets are busted up blood cells that are little fragments, and they're busted up for a reason, to aid in blood clotting. So each one of those formed elements has its own particular function. The red cells to carry blood gases, the white cells for immune response. White cells are for immune response. It's the red blood cells that carry your blood gases. What carries the other kinds of nutrients? What carries glucose? Where would you find it in the blood? If I'm glucose, sugar, what part of the blood am I riding around on or in? Nobody knows? Maybe nobody in here knows. Take a guess. In the plasma, yeah. Because glucose is small and dissolvable. So, nutrients are in the plasma. Gases are on the red blood cells. These are for defense, platelets for blood clotting. I mean, you know that diabetic people check their blood glucose daily. I want you to relate things like that you already know to this more abstract type of knowledge. And then, this subdivides every other thing that you can find in the blood and what category it falls into. If you're in nursing, going into nursing, this will be a good review chart to actually come back and look at in the future. So for the cells and the formed elements, which are white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, they all come from the same, ancestor cells, which are called hematopoietic stem cells. There are stem cells in your body that make blood cells, and they are of the type called hematopoietic, and you find them in the bone marrow. Your bone marrow makes blood cells. Is that weird? I thought that was weird when I first learned it. But blood has to come from somewhere. The cell parts come from your bone marrow, which is why if you have problems with your blood cells, you might need a bone marrow transplant so that you can start over. So that you can start over making new healthy blood cells. This picture is mostly important for the overall concept, not the details, not the in-between details, but knowing that all of the types of white blood cells and red blood cells come from stem cells that you have in your bone marrow. So now we're going to talk more specifically about red blood cells. I really like red blood cells because of the way that they look. I think it's cool. So here's a realistic depiction of how they actually look, and you can see this on slides next week in lab, and a cartoon of how they look. And they look like a donut that is not all the way punched out. Like if you didn't actually punch out a donut hole, but you kind of lazily make a hole and didn't punch it all the way through. That's how they look, and that has a purpose. That shape is biconcave. Did you learn concave and convex before? Cave is like caved in. Biconcave. Yeah. And the reason that they're like that is because that gives a lot of surface area. It has a large surface compared to its volume, which lets it move oxygen and CO2 in and on and off of here really easily. If it was just spherical, it wouldn't have as big of a surface area relative to the inside. And because they're biconcave, they can squish and squeeze to get through little capillaries. Because the smallest capillaries are not a whole lot wider than one of these. They have to squish and squeeze. And their shape lets them do that. They actually don't have a nucleus anymore. They did when they were younger and less mature, but once they mature to a functional red blood cell, they don't have a nucleus, and that matters for two reasons. There's more space for oxygen, but if they don't have a nucleus, they won't live long. It makes them die sooner, but in the meantime, they can do their job better because they don't have a nucleus.
Where does the nucleus go?
Where does it go?
Like if they have one, then it just disappears.
It kind of, they don't eject it. That's a really good question. It sort of breaks down and gets reabsorbed into the cell. But they don't just kick it out as a whole nucleus. They sort of recycle the parts, so to speak.
So they lose in a lifetime, it's not like an evolution?
Let me show you. Well, they are showing it kicking it out. Okay, so here's the lineage going to red blood cells. There's a stem cell. It goes through some, I don't want to say evolution. In a Pokemon sense, yes, but not in a biological sense. It is changing its morphology. And you can see that the nucleus starts out really big. It shrinks down. This is showing it kind of kicking it out, so maybe it does. But during its maturation, let's say, it loses it. And then once it loses it, it starts being ready to act as a blood cell, but it can't live long without having a nucleus to make new proteins for it. Good questions. So you all know Pokemon. That's, okay, that's good. I know a little bit about it because my kids like it. So no nucleus, can carry more oxygen, also carry more CO2 to help us get rid of it. Inside a red blood cell, the major component is a protein called hemoglobin. You've probably heard of hemoglobin. This is a cartoon drawing of what hemoglobin protein actually looks like. And so it's made out of 4 different pieces of protein, and then it has these heme groups in it, which has this shape. This is not something to memorize. The shape is not something to memorize, but you need to know what hemoglobin is, where you find it, and what it does. This iron right here, this iron ion is stuck into hemoglobin, and it's critical that hemoglobin has this if it's going to actually carry oxygen around. This is why iron is related to blood. Or if you're iron deficient and you're anemic, why should anybody care about that? Well, if you don't have enough iron, you can't make proper hemoglobin and you can't carry oxygen well. So you know before it's bad to be anemic. It means you don't have enough iron sometimes. This is, connecting that with structures and how blood functions. One thing that students usually don't know before this class, they might know hemoglobin, that it carries oxygen. CO2 also rides around on there. It carries oxygen and it carries CO2 throughout the body. So that's the main role of red blood cells, is to carry oxygen. If people are having trouble carrying enough oxygen in their blood, we say that they have anemia. Sometimes anemia is because they don't eat enough iron in their diet. Sometimes it's because they're eating enough iron but they can't absorb it in their digestive system. for them, you know, they could take this iron all day long. If they can't absorb it, it won't help them. Sometimes they have a problem with making that hemoglobin protein. They have enough iron, but they're not assembling it correctly with hemoglobin. Sometimes they're not making red blood cells correctly. Or sometimes they don't have enough blood in their body, which there could be a lot of different reasons. Could be all different reasons. But if they're not carrying enough oxygen, we call it anemia. Sometimes people will have anemia after, like, childbirth, or after they've lost a lot of blood from trauma injuries. And that's usually a temporary situation. So normally, if your body does not have enough blood cells, your body can sense that, and it will tell your liver and your kidneys, after sensing, oh, you don't have enough oxygen in your blood, that provides a signal to your liver and your kidneys to make a particular hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. Have you heard of it? It used to be that this was a popular way of doping for
Still is.
cardiovascular things. But I feel like it's not like the hot doping thing of the moment. Still used. It's not in the news as much. But that's EPO. EPO is a hormone. I think I want you to start keeping a list of hormones. I may have you start that in lab next week. Like, keep a list of every hormone that we talk about, and then write out to the side what it does and where it comes from. That'll be useful for the future. So, EPO is made by combining factors from the liver and the kidney. What's its target organ? It ends up causing more red blood cells.
Bone marrow.
Yeah. Its receptors would be in the bone marrow. And it would cause them to start making more red blood cells. And then when you make more red blood cells, hopefully your oxygen carrying capacity goes up, and that feeds back and is sensed by liver and kidneys, and they'll quit making as much EPO. If you give yourself artificial EPO from outside your body, how is that going to help you athletically?
You carry more oxygen.
You carry more oxygen. So, how does that help?
Recover more faster.
You get more function out of your
Blood
cells.
To your muscles, right?
Yeah. Every process in your body would work a little bit better. But, what's wrong with having too many red blood cells in your blood? Let's go back several pictures. Why don't you want your hematocrit to be really high? Where'd that go?
Blood becomes too thick.
Why is that a problem? If your blood is too thick, is what he said.
It doesn't go through things.
It's sluggish. You'll tend to clog. You tend to get strokes. Great. Dangerous.
So what, you just get blood drawn every now and then to solve that, or what?
You could. You could get blood drawn to solve it,
Or what do
but
they
it's
do?
a dangerous thing to get your red blood cell numbers up too high. Also, who's going to do that for
Somebody-
you without getting you in trouble?
But could you have like too much of that hormone naturally?
Some people do.
And then how do
If you did have, let me go back to the slide that goes with EPO while I'm talking about this. It's possible that you could have too much EPO naturally, and there probably are people who do. They would probably show somewhat of a natural inclination to cardiovascular excellence, let's say. But they would also show a natural inclination toward strokes and blood clots. as well.
So
And if people like that were to, be tested during sports organization bodies testing, it's possible that they could test positive for doping even though that was their natural level. But you would think that that would happen before they got up to like really supreme competitive levels. They would find that out. But EPO is a hormone made by a combination of liver and kidney function. It increases red blood cell numbers. No matter how many red blood cells you have, whether it's a normal number or too few, they're going to be short-lived because they don't have a nucleus. And so when they start to get too old and broken down, they're broken down in the liver. Again, it's kind of interesting. The liver is involved in their birth, the liver is involved in their death, and the spleen breaks them down also. They go through the spleen can filter out damaged ones, and they get broken down there. I want to end today with a video clip. It's a really good one. And we'll pick up with this material probably in lab on Monday.
43-year-old Travis Glenn is in pain nearly every day of his life. Pain caused by sickle cell disease. He recently kept a diary of his pain while participating in a study published in Annals of Internal Medicine. The study found that patients suffering from sickle cell disease are in much greater pain than originally believed and try to manage their pain at home.
Constant pain, nagging pain every day, all day. Sometimes worse than others, some days a little worse than others, but definitely every day you got a little pain.
Imagine somebody taking a baseball bat and hitting you on your shin, and hitting you on your shin, and continuing to hit you on your shin for hours at a time. That's the kind of pain patients describe.
Dr. Wally Smith led the study that looked at 232 patients and monitored their levels of pain associated with sickle cell disease.
Pain in sickle cell disease is a pretty much everyday phenomenon. A third of our patients said they had pain nearly every day. We had at least half of our patients saying that they were in pain over half of their days.
Sickle cell disease is caused by a mutation in a red blood cell gene that changes the smooth, round blood cell into a sickle-shaped or C-shaped cell that's stiff and sticky and tends to clump and get stuck in the blood vessels.
They take the shape of a sickle because inside of them an abnormal hemoglobin called sickle hemoglobin, stretching them and deforming them. Those cells then cannot navigate very small blood vessels. They get torn up in the process. Oxygen is not delivered to the tissues. Patients have pain, organ damage, early death.
A lot of us with sickle cell, the sad thing is, don't live to get very old. And that's one of the harsher realities.
Researchers say the results of the Annals of Internal Medicine study could change the way the disease is treated.
I believe this is a landmark study. I believe that this study will change the way people view this disease. Think of it as a chronic pain syndrome. And I believe that the results will have implications both for policy, for medical care, and I hope for research.
On behalf of the American College of Physicians, I'm Jim Lawrence.
So we will talk about red blood cells and sickle cell anemia during lecture on Monday. The blood typing stuff we'll save for lab. So on Monday in here, you need to bring notes for red blood cells and the second part of the blood notes. And we'll have our reading quiz on that blood 2 part on Monday. See you then.